a human virtue like courage and we put it with a theological virtue like hope. And that's what this gospel is really about. It's really about courage. You see, these three guys have been given talents. And talents, of course, is a representation of money. But talents, of course, means something completely different to all of us here. And the fellow with a lot of ability, the guy with a lot of talent, so to speak, takes the money from the landowner and he invests it and he risks his money. And he could have risked it all and lost it. And that master could have come back. And I wonder what the master would have done. I don't think the master would have cared, by the way. Because what he was really seeing about his servants is what they are willing to risk. And that first guy and the second guy risked it all. They didn't take any of it and hoard it away. They put it all into the mix. And it worked out for them in the sense that they doubled their money. The guy with 5 had 10. The guy with 2 had 4. But it's that third guy that's really disturbing to me. That third guy is so easy to follow. He is so afraid of losing what he has that he goes and he buries it in the ground. He takes his talent and he will not risk losing everything. Even though he knows exactly who this man is who has lent him the money. He says, I know you're a hard man. I know you're difficult. And you reap where you do not sow. And you gather where you did not scatter. He knew who this guy was. And yet what happened was he chose in fear not to risk the talent that was given to him. And the moral of this parable, the moral of this story, and Matthew goes on in the next few verses of chapter 25 to go and talk about how we invest ourselves. It is a risk to be a Christian. It is a risk to love. It is a risk to have courage. But courage is that by which we take the talents that God has given us and we put it into action. We put it into play. And yes, we might lose it. We might lose what we have been given, but I guarantee you that we have a master who is kind and generous. And so if we use whatever we are given to the glory of God and the glory of the kingdom and for the love of our neighbor, that takes an incredible amount of courage in order to do this. Every single one of us in here has a talent, has a gift, has something that God has given us. It may not be the same as other people, but how are we taking the gifts that God has given us and putting them into play? How are we doing those things for the greater glory of the kingdom of God? How are we doing the things that are in our life and investing ourselves? How are we risking ourselves and the gifts that we have been given? Because if we have entered into that relationship of prayer with God, as we hear last night from St. Teresa of Avila, it is like a great deluge of His grace. It's like a great flood of His grace. And now that we have been given that gift of His grace, it is now time for us to courageously put that into action. But what is the thing that stops that third man? What is the thing that stops that fellow in the parable? And of course, we have this word right here. That's exactly right. Does anybody know what that stands for? Anybody heard that acronym? False events appearing real. That's what fear means. Another acronym, I don't know if you've ever heard this, is forget everything and run. That's precisely what he did, isn't it? Fear is a great motivator. It usually motivates us in negative ways. And fear is something, again, I'll say that again. It's forget everything and run, or false events appearing real. See, he had this false notion of who his master really was. His master gave him those things in order to see how he was going to risk it. And he really didn't understand the truth of his own perceptions. So he forgot everything and he ran away. And what that does is it leaves all of those gifts and all of those talents that God had given to him, that landowner had given to him to invest and to use. And it became nothing but buried in the ground. One of my favorite authors is named C.S. Lewis. And one of my absolute favorite quote of all time comes from C.S. Lewis. And he says, to love anything at all is to risk having your heart broken. He says, if you never want to have your heart broken, never get attached to anything or anyone, even a pet or an animal. Just bury your heart in the ground. Cover it with luxuries and little hobbies. And while it is there, safe from being broken, it will become hard and unlovable and irredeemable. He says the only way to save yourself from the perturbations of love is hell. And that's precisely what it is. When we take our hearts, when we take the things that we have and we bury them in fear, our hearts and our talents will become useless and hard and irredeemable. So what we are really called to, not only by Jesus Christ, but by these three women, is this great risk of our own selves. And when we look at things like the cross, and there's a cross over there, and is there one behind me? No. We look at things like the cross. Jesus is risking everything for us. He risks his very life, and God the Father puts everything onto the table for us. And we have to ask ourselves if we are using the grace of God in a way that brings light and grace and peace. Now, fear is actually a reaction to something else. And this is sort of the thing I've been working on here. So I'm going to just take a little break from these three women and tell you what we're going to return to this. But the real basis of fear, and this is what the result is of sin, is this. Last night, do you remember when we were reading the story of Adam and Eve and how they had the first sin? And sin is the inability or unwillingness to love. The first thing that happens to them is that they clothe themselves. And this shame, the definition of shame that I give it, is the idea or the belief that there is something that makes me unlovable. It's something that makes me unlovable by God. It's something that makes me unlovable by other people. And it's something that makes me unlovable by myself. And a lot of people live, especially in our culture, with a great deal of shame. And it is this shame from sin, it is this result of the inability or the unwillingness to love that does what I mentioned last night. And it puts us on an island by ourselves. Now, some people suffer a great deal from shame. Other people don't suffer so much. But shame is this idea, again, that there is something so bad about me, that there's something wrong with me, that there's something unlovable or irredeemable about me, that God can't love it, you can't love it, and I can't love it. And what shame does is that it produces fear. And so what happens is we begin to run away from what we perceive our shame to be. And so this shame is something that Jesus comes to tell us that no matter where we have been and what we have done, or what has been done to us, that we are completely lovable. But it is this very shame that makes people take their talents and their gifts and the abilities that they have been given and bury them in the ground. It's not because the gift is bad or the ability is bad, but it's because we have this fear, or they have this fear, that if somebody sees the entire me, or if I have to see the entire me, I'm not going to love myself, or they're not going to love me. Another definition I give shame is backwards pride. I call it backwards pride because we say that we are so bad that God can't love us. And so we hide. We hide our talents. We hide our gifts. We hide behind all sorts of things. And this is where a lot of the pathologies of the world come from. And basically, as I mentioned last night, in terms of Adam and Eve, all sin and all shame basically come from one thing, and that's being abandoned. You see, Adam and Eve abandoned each other in the first sin. Then they turned around and they abandoned God. And they continually abandoned each other because they did not want to experience the shame that they felt, because in that first sin they actually believed that they were unlovable by God. And the entire purpose of the cross, the entire investment of Jesus Christ into us, the entire reason for the incarnation is for Jesus Christ to come and to tell us that even in the midst of our sinfulness, even in our inability or unwillingness to love, even in the midst of what we feel makes us unlovable, He still completely loves us. And if you don't believe that, read the story of the prodigal son. That father gives that son everything. He invests everything in that son, only to lose it all, including his son. But he stands there and waits for him to come back. So shame and fear separate us from each other. It makes us on this island. It kind of looks like an egg. I ate breakfast. I'm not hungry. It separates us from each other.